Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Heath Jones, still with no haircut if you're watching on YouTube. Soon, I've promised my wife, soon I will be getting a haircut as I need it. But that's neither here nor there. If you don't know, I pastor a church in Indianapolis, Indiana called Northwood Christian Church, hence the name, the Northwood Podcast. If you would like to learn more about our church, our values, what we're about, what we do, I'd encourage you to check out our website, which is www.indncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. But that aside, this podcast could not happen without the good folks at the All Indiana Podcast Network. What I do is I record this here in my church, and then I send them the recordings. And then they take care of all the rest. They distribute them. I would love to even just give a shout out to the name. I haven't asked the individual who I usually send this stuff to, but I'm grateful for you if you're listening. So thank you. And if you like, you should check out the dozens of other podcasts across a variety of topics that they produce and support. You may do so by going to wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. Now, today we'll be talking over a passage that could leave some of us feeling glum, kind of down, which is not what I'm wanting to do, so bear with us. I'll be going over a passage in the Bible found in Mark 8 where Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to be put to death. And what's more, he tells his disciples that they should expect similar treatment going forward. And so he tells them, us, to take up ours, own crosses in our own time. So what might this mean? How should we think of this? More on that in a moment. But first, we must pause for some ads for our podcast audience. If this means you, I'll catch you after this short break. 2, 3, 4, and we're back. And as I was saying, today we'll be going over a passage found in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8. More specifically, chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. That's Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. And without further delay, here goes. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the angels." It used to be that I thought of sermons on passages like this to be right in my wheelhouse. I somewhat enjoyed preaching a gloomy sermon, I guess. Maybe that's just where my own head was at the time, because I felt it resonated with me. It fit with my experience of the world. There is something true about what he says in this passage about a disciple's calling. Ours, I have found, is a calling into hard places because the world is just that hard. So in Jesus naming this, he's telling us the truth. He's just telling us like it is. He's letting us know what we may be in for. And there are other sayings and parables Jesus tells that make the same or similar points. One of the more famous ones, perhaps you've heard, found in Luke's Gospel, chapter 14, where Jesus makes the following point, that if you're going to build a building, you're setting out to do this, before you even start, make sure you know what you're in for. You don't show up with just a few nails and your old hammer and some spare wood, expecting things to go smooth. You need a plan, you need to prepare. And in that context, Jesus made the point that before you undertake any project or journey, large or small, you have to count the cost. That is, know what you're in for. And to tie this point to discipleship, because this is about what it will require of us to be a disciple of Jesus. As I was saying, to tie this point to discipleship, it is as much to say, count the cost. Know what you're in for so that when your calling leads you into danger, you will not be surprised. Disciple of Jesus, don't be surprised when things get hard because of your discipleship. Well, I'm veering off into the main point. Let's get back to our story in Mark chapter 8. To give it some context, this encounter with Jesus comes just after Peter has correctly identified Jesus as the Messiah. He was then lauded for this and received Jesus' version of an attaboy. But now we discover that Peter's understanding of what a Messiah is has been all wrong, probably even when he named Jesus as the Messiah. Peter, you'll come to discover if you continue to read the Gospels, thought that a Messiah would be a strong leader with military prowess, someone who could meet Rome and beat them at their own game. Rome was the occupying presence at the time. In short, he thought that Roman rule would be thrown off through Rome's methods, through violence, because that is how Rome had conquered. And so, with this mindset, Peter hears Jesus say the following words. Ones I just read, calls his disciples together. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. The cross being an instrument for execution, not a religious symbol. It's like saying, take up your electric chair and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Peter hears these words, a stark contrast to his own expectations, and he rebuked Peter first, but this is what follows, and this is the answer to his rebuke, because he did not expect Jesus to go and die. Simply put, for Peter, and for mostly everyone else, that's losing. He expected Jesus to live and to fight, and this is why Peter drew his sword to fight off the Roman soldiers on the night Jesus was arrested. He thinks, like most of us think, that when someone comes at you, you fight fire with fire, sword to sword. But Jesus does not go in with this. And Peter could have known better. Jesus tells Peter, put away the sword. Those that live by the sword die by the sword. Jesus says, basically, in context of today's lesson, if I did that, if you do that, if I did that, I'd lose my life. If I, Jesus, participate, not me. To paraphrase what Jesus means in this passage, if he were to participate in the violence and the ways of this world to get things done, he would have become as lost as the world is. Of course, he could not, with God's Spirit so welled up in him, but Peter could become lost if he doesn't get this right. And this is what Jesus wants us to know. This intuition of Jesus, it does fly in the face of common wisdom of his day and ours. Lose your life to save it. It seems on face counterintuitive, but it all depends on what you mean by life. Jesus lived 32 years or thereabouts on this earth before he was killed. In what way did he save his own life? In fact, he was mocked while he died because those around him thought him so foolish. Seems to me that he lost it, seemed to them at the time. Again, it all depends on what you mean by life. If you mean life in the most literal sense, then no, Jesus did not save his physical life there in that moment, at least not through his execution. And later his disciples, or so the story goes, faced similar fates, each facing violence, persecution, and then deaths in their own turns. So in what sense did these disciples find life, if Jesus is correct? Again, it all depends on what you mean by life. And Jesus was looking at the big picture. He knew that many individuals could save their own lives and then live rather comfortably in a world still in need of redemption. What with all the struggles and problems, some of us feel like it's as best as we can do to keep calm, keep our heads down, and stay safe. Just good advice, some would say. Some have even thought of safety and security as the ultimate goals of their religion. Some Christians have seen it as the goal, what they've signed up for. And to that mindset, Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." In other words, Peter's impulse to self-protection and saving Jesus from harm does not come from God. At least not in that moment in time. Then was not the time to run. It was the time to face fears. So that temptation to run, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." That's a temptation from hell. All this to say, Jesus' rebuke is a big-time rebuke meant to correct apparently a serious error. That error is described by Bible scholar Dr. Ron Allen as glory-only theology. Glory-only theology is a theology that assumes that to walk as a disciple is to walk a steady path toward our own crown with no struggle in the time in between. And Jesus here names that line of thought as demonic. It gets so in the way between us and the progress the world needs to make with our help. So he names it as demonic because of the danger that apathy and carelessness may bring. The world needs less apathetic people. And if God's people only see their calling as a calling toward greatness, security, safety, and happiness, then when the time comes to take great risks, God's people will be caught off guard and will be unprepared. When the time comes to march for the cause of justice, Christians will make every excuse, and we have. When the time comes to struggle through some social change, Christians will say, "I didn't sign up for this." When the time comes to take unpopular positions on this war economy, capitalistic greed, and our racist institutions, we will shy away from naming these evils because we always thought we were destined for glory, only glory, safety, and positions of strength. So in that spirit, I say, get behind us, Satan, for we do not usually have in mind the things of God, but rather the things that are all too human. Now, before we move on, I should make another point, not to get lost in the weeds, but it's important to note that the purpose of such suffering is not the suffering itself. It needs to be said, in case you hear the wrong thing here. We should avoid suffering when we can, hardships when we can, when we should. We should not seek it out for its own sake. Christians are called to be gluttons for punishment. Some people seem to think that the religious life is one marked with suffering because God's people are simply that. And just need to self-abase ourselves. Not so. Of this, biblical commentator Micah Keel writes, quoting him, "Jesus does not suffer and die because suffering is good. The necessity of the suffering comes from the way Jesus lives. A series of actions that pay no heed to social and religious norms. A life that reaches out to those who are ostracized, unclean, or marginalized." And I like that because how it frames where the suffering comes from. It comes when we are putting ourselves in a place to stand up for those who are marginalized, who stand up in those places where there needs to be a brave and courageous voice and physical presence. And standing up there, that's where we find life. But the reality is, to get from where we are to where we need to be will be very hard. And Jesus knew this and saw his own path bending towards a cross in the holy city Jerusalem as something that was very difficult to face. But the suffering was not the point. And of this, Bible commentator Bruce Epperly writes, "The cross is on the horizon. Although Jesus has choices and can choose to bypass Jerusalem, avoiding the suffering, his destiny calls him forward, risking death to be true to God. We too must take risks to be faithful." This is a hard passage in part because we do our best to manage risk and to assess cost and benefit. We want to avoid physical and emotional pain whenever possible. Often, others' sorrows are simply too much to bear. Followers of Jesus, however, must be willing to embrace suffering for the greater good of others and to follow God's call. End quote. So, are you, after hearing this, like Peter or like I have been at times, surprised or uncomfortable at the call of Jesus. But we should not be surprised because Jesus has told us, we just read the passage, told us long ago that we may expect this when he said, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. There it is. Plain as day. It is what we've signed up for, should the moment come. Now, I admit, at this point in the sermon, is where I in the past have floundered. Not in every case, but in situations where it becomes necessary to remind ourselves that the way forward will certainly require sacrifice, suffering, and all that have been going on with, and possibly even, goodness gracious, our very lives. So I admit, in the past, I've struggled to know where to land a sermon like this. I mean, can the point really be that do this or God will be ashamed of you, and if you draw back in fear, you will be rejected by God, as the end of the text alludes to? Now, what Jesus meant by that is more complicated than that, but still, the end of our text tells us that if we aren't able to bravely stand up when the standing is necessary in the name of Jesus, then in the end of things, when the world is judged and all of its creatures are judged, we will discover that we lost ourselves in those moments. When we were trying to save ourselves, we lost ourselves. But when we are able to stand, we find ourselves and realize what Jesus would discover, because Jesus did suffer and die. He lived into his words. And if that were all there was to tell, then I'm not sure we should be following his advice, if that were the end. But rumor has it, Jesus did not stay dead. And Easter is coming. And we'll be talking about that a whole lot later, but in the weeks to come. But it was discovered after Jesus was killed that this movement of God was really just getting going. And here we are. It didn't die, though its leader was hung up on a cross and killed. Who would have thunk it? And he took up that cross to teach us, in part, that there are worse things than sacrificing one's energy, resources, time, or one's very life, so long as the cause is right and just. Some things are just worth it. Taking up a cross to end hunger in the world, worth it. Jesus did that. Taking up a cross to end prejudice in the world, worth it. Jesus did that. And so have many others since, and I believe there will be more crosses to bear before this is all over. Or at least this moment in history that seems like a spring ready to let loose, hopefully in a good way. We could go on. It would be worth bearing a cross to end war, to end greed, to change our collective human hearts. The list goes on, and this is what Jesus did. And now we are invited into the movement. It will cost us, true, but the world we fight for is worth it. Jesus described it, this place where everyone has what they need to live well, prisoners freed, injustices rectified. You can read about that vision in Luke chapter 4 and other places besides. And Jesus died for this. But as I've been saying, his story did not end there. He rose again, and this teaches us that the worst that may be done to us is not enough to stop God's movement of love. The church rose from what seemed like the ashes of a movement, and now here we are, each asked to take up our own crosses in turn. Should we, too, be put under by violence or poverty as a result of our faithfulness? We, too, will find life on the other side. The same Spirit of God that animated Jesus and called him to life dwells in us. Indeed, it fell onto the church. It is in you. In the meantime, are we able to shoulder the burden? The good news is we don't have to shoulder it alone. Jesus invites disciples, plural, all of us, along the way for this very reason, to discover our need for one another and to give of ourselves for our lives together and the lives of generations to come and for the very life of the world. So take up your cross and do not be afraid. It'll be okay. the Easter sun will still rise after your long, dark night.